Whatever you say is going to be recorded.
Text or call me.
All right, thanks, Joshua. She's got the recording going. Debbie does.
Okay, so
So-
Arla's starting.
Okay, so should we go ahead?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, let's.
All right. Do you know all of these people who are here? I think with so few, I'm gonna have them introduce themselves. Is that all right with you?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
And you want to stand up at the mic because it's being
Where's
recorded.
the, oh my goodness.
Otherwise, I would say the microphone.
Oh, we
Yeah.
didn't text it, Mike, but it'll pick up the sound just
All
fine.
right.
And do we need to let?
Do you
Yeah,
want to
lovely.
turn this on? Go ahead.
Yeah, that's the only way people will see you too.
Go ahead and check it for us.
Mr. What?
It's a Zoom meeting, so you have to stay where you are with the.
Okay, all right, I'll stay where I am. Is the mic? This doesn't appear to be working.
No, it's not.
Just thinking about it.
Forgot to check it, but we didn't.
Boy, you jumped in with both people, huh?
I
I know. Oh my
Right
gosh.
in it.
See if I can hear.
Let's see here. Just fine.
Nope.
No, keep checking. Keep checking it.
Yeah,
There, yeah.
is it on?
Yeah.
Okay, all right.
Okay, everyone here?
Are we ready to roar?
All right, let's
We're
do it.
ready to roar.
Well, I really want to welcome all of you here tonight. We're pleased that you would come, and we have a good program for you. And my name is Arla Funk. I'm on the advisory board for the Community Council. And Esther Hunter, who is the chair, is, I think, on an airplane between here and Austin, Texas. She has a son who has moved back from France after being gone 7 years. And so she has gone to visit him. Because there are so few of us, I'd like to just quickly have you introduce yourselves. It's nice if we get to know each other and just tell a couple of things about yourself. And let's start in the very back with, and we'd love it if you'd move up close. Just come on in. Let's have a tight knit group tonight. Come on up front, come on up closer. Oh, you don't have to if you don't want to, but.
I never said front. All right, I'll come a little bit closer.
Okay, all right.
I'm sitting around at 208 South Douglas. Can I go this way?
Okay, sir, would you introduce yourself?
I'm Dan Shelling, and I'm here with Save Our Foothills. I'll be talking more about myself in a few minutes.
Okay,
So-
very good. Yes, and you have to leave early, so we'll hear it. And the woman in black. Yes,
Joy Walden. I live on 7th South.
okay. And
Well, I'm Nate Siegel, it's my wife Hannah Galbraith. We live on 4th South in Douglas, and we're going to be moving over to 12th East shortly.
There's house to one block. Where is that?
The Jacobsons house.
So Jake, in first and second house.
okay.
Sorry.
Say what you said.
Pause.
It's 274 South, 1200, so it's on the corner of 3rd South and 1200.
I'm Lynette Buchanan, and I live on 800 South, about 1150 East. So,
And
And I'm Amber. I'll be speaking after Dan, I believe. I actually also live on 8th East. So.
David,
Hi, David Shutt. I live on 10th and Broadway.
And Jerry Fowles, I'm one of the co-trustees for the university area. So,
okay. Well, we're happy to have you here, and I am just going to go ahead and turn the time over to Jerry because she's the one who put the program together tonight. And we hope you'll learn a lot about how to do historic preservation on your home.
Okay, I also want to
mention Debbie Fetter, because she has actually done a lot of the work in getting this program put together. So, and she's on the call as listening in. So I just want to mention real quickly about our nominations for a couple of things. I want to welcome Lynette, who is part of ELPCO,
Actually, I'm part of ECC.
ECC,
Yeah.
but you're going to be a liaison
Liaison.
for us, right? Let's see, and David is new. I want to welcome you. Thank you for joining us. And we do have a couple of things that are open. We're still looking for a rep for the Benyon area, an ECC business advisor, a student representative, and also a chair for our Porch Fest, which will be a lot of fun this summer. Someone who can pull together some talent from our area, and we've got a place where we can do that. Neighborhood Watch. So we're looking for anyone who wants to volunteer, and then we will have nominations hopefully in February, which will be our next meeting, February 9th. And I'm going to turn it over to Dan. Yes. Linda.
Alicia Miller on there is also my co-person.
Oh, I
or
didn't
she's-
mention Alicia.
she's okay,
Yes,
she's there
thank you,
on Zoom.
Alicia.
She
Thank
is
you.
part of ELPCO, but she and I will be.
You'll be working
we'll
together.
work together.
Wonderful. And thank you as well, Alicia. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Dan.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, and you can just let me know. You can just let me know when you want me to move to the next slide.
See the slides, okay. Thank you, everyone, for coming here. My name is Dan Schelling. I'm a geologist. I've been living in Salt Lake City for almost 30 years. And I would say somewhere between 2 and 3 times a week for the last 30 years, I've been getting into the foothills unless I've been traveling internationally. So I've been up there thousands of times. So that's really what I'm here to talk about is the foothills. And specifically, Save Our Foothills. Perhaps you've seen the signs around town. Perhaps you've heard about us. What I want to do is briefly talk about who we are, why we formed, and what it is that we're trying to accomplish. Go ahead and change the slide. Do want to begin by acknowledging that we live on the traditional and ancestral homelands of the Ute, Shoshone, Paiute, and Gashute tribes. When we're in the foothills, it's nice to keep that in mind. These were the stewards of the lands prior to the pioneers coming. And I'm glad that the mayor and the city are beginning to recognize that it's worth acknowledging them and the place they had here. Next slide. So who are we? So Save Our Foothills, it's a conservation campaign, and we're dedicated to the preservation of the foothills natural areas adjacent to Salt Lake City. We're committed to protecting the environmental integrity of these fragile public lands and for future generations, and encourage responsible enjoyment of the Salt Lake City foothills. Again, I want to stress we're a conservation campaign. Let's go to the next one. So why did we form? Save Our Foothills formed in response to problems we encountered when the city began implementing their Foothills Trail System Plan in 2020 and 2021. I don't know how many of you here have been up in the foothills in the last couple of years and seen a lot of new trails, many of them built with backhoes up in the hills. So we saw some problems. First one that jumped out is really the 15 miles of poorly built and unsustainable trails that caused land and habitat destruction, hillside collapse, and unnecessary scarring of hillsides. There's an example of the picture seen below with the backhoe that was used for building the trails. And in addition, the closure and destruction of existing trails that have been used for decades by Salt Lake City residents. So I'm just going to run through a few slides because it's a lot easier to see what I'm talking about than for me to describe it. But let me first point out the Foothills Trail System Plan. It's a plan to construct over 65 miles of new trails in the Salt Lake City foothills that you can see from downtown from here as well. And the trail system plan was presented to and voted on by the city council in January of 2020 as a master plan. And it turns out it's not a master plan. They quickly backtracked and said it was a system plan because they hadn't done a lot of the background work you expect in a master plan. It was also presented as an all or nothing thing to do. We're going to build 65 miles of trails, say yes or no, as opposed to maybe we should think about how many of these trails we want to build. So phase one of the plan involved the construction of 15 miles of trails. They've already been constructed. And this was initiated in the spring of 2020. Work continued through 2021 until Save Our Foothills, Save Our Canyons, and a number of city residents started complaining and convinced the mayor and the city to put a pause in place on trail construction. Go to the next one. So just to give you an example of some of the problems, problem one, construction of unsafe, unsustainable, and unsightly trails. This trail cuts across a hillside that had no trails on it previously. This is above what's called the Morris Meadows. This trail can be seen from the Salt Lake City Airport. I have a little arrow showing a boulder that's been undercut by the trail. Big rainstorm, that boulder could easily come crashing down. And you can see in the foreground, when they build a 3, 4, or 5 foot wide trail, it cuts back into the hillside anywhere from 3 to 15 feet, dump material down the hillside, including invasive weeds. That can be another 15, 20, even 30 feet. Let's go to the next one. Fragmentation and destruction of plant and wildlife habitat. So I'm looking down towards Morris Meadows, and you can see a couple of the trails cutting through here. These trails were built through oak and maple groves. At least one of them had a family of coyote living in there. There were fox, owls, hawks. Now, I do mention that they're mountain bike trails, downhill mountain bike trails. The problem here is that these are fairly high-speed vehicles when they're going downhill. Needless to say, the coyote families moved out, but you can see that there are a lot of other animals that aren't going to live there, raise families at this point. Next.
Good. I already.
Oh, thank you. Okay, next is trail duplication, multiplication, redundancy. Here's a photograph. I'm up on Twin Peaks, and you can see a ridgeline trail that's been there for decades. People have used it. And you can see where the new trail is. It was built, gouged into the hillside, in many cases only 50 to 100 feet from an existing trail. Keep in mind, the estimate is that these cost $150,000 per mile to build. So when you're building a trail that's right next to another, I think we can think of that as being wasted money in many cases. Next. What got a lot of people quite angry initially was we're looking at a trail that had existed for many, many decades, probably close to 100 years. And the city decided they wanted to let it revegetate and restore it. So they dug this huge trench through it. They put up fences and built a new trail down the hill. I'm happy to say the city has backtracked. They admitted this was a mistake. They're going to fill in the trenches, but they literally didn't spend a penny on revegetation. All they did was dig the trenches and build a new trail. I'll go to the next one. Construction of trails in geologically unsuitable and unstable locations. A particular problem in City Creek Canyon, and this is one of them. You can see where when they dig out about 3 feet, it gouges out the hillside. The trail I'm showing in the upper right-hand photograph, that one slumped within about 3 months of being built. And then rainstorms came, so they put in some material to hold it in place. And the next rainstorm, all that washed down as well. So this is an ongoing problem. As a geologist, I could have told them this was not a wise place to put a trail. This clued us into another issue. Next, please. Which was that there was a lack of scientific and user studies before they went ahead and started constructing the trails. What are the types of studies you expect if it's a master plan? Ecological studies, wildlife habitat, cultural, historical. No cultural studies. There have been arrowheads found up in here, but nobody thought to talk with any of the Native American tribes. Slope stability, I mentioned, soil watershed. In addition, there were no studies on recreational use. It was just assumed that many more people were using the trails and no one actually had any data on this. Next. Okay,
It was this, yeah, this
that's
one.
right. So in July of 2021, the mayor said, we're going to put a pause on construction. We see some problems. So what's changed since then? And I'm going to have to step over here to remind myself. So based on the concerns that Save Our Foothills, Save Our Canyons, and city residents raised, so Mayor Mendenhall announced in July 2021 to put a pause on construction. Come September of 2021, the mayor decided we better wait till the summer of 2022. There are enough problems we need to address before we just move forward constructing any more trails. So in December of last year, the city hired an environmental consulting firm. And we're glad they hired them. It's something they should have done in the beginning. And they were hired to look at trail impacts on plant and wildlife, trail impacts on soil, scenic impacts of trails, cultural impacts of trails. I want to point out, though, that it's all trail directed, except the last part, which is potential cultural significance of foothills areas to indigenous tribes. We are trying to get the Salt Lake public and the city to think of this as being an environmentally precious area and not just focus on trails, but look at it in a wider context. But nonetheless, they did hire this consulting firm, SWCA, to evaluate these aspects. And the map down below, you can see the original work done in the trail plan identified some habitat study areas. And we're really hoping that SWCA looks at these seriously, these habitat study areas, but we don't know the results of the study yet. Go to the next one. Okay, so on March 10th of 2022, Public Lands proposed and asked the city council, they wanted to put a further extension on the pause on trail construction in place until about the summer of 2023. And that was because they wanted to hire a consulting firm to address some of the issues we've raised before, and I've got a number of them up here, but to evaluate trail construction, reevaluate the existing demand on trails, prepare a foothill system maintenance plan. There had been no maintenance plan in place prior to this, which needless to say is an issue. In any case, in August of 2022, the city finally hired a group, a consulting firm, to start looking at these issues and consider changes to the original plan. They asked the city council to say, okay, we need a pause till at least the summer of 2023. It'll probably be late summer, early autumn 2023 before we have any results from that. But they also asked for funds for a couple of other things. One of those was to restore the gouged out trail I showed you before. We're very happy about that. But also to hire a consulting firm for community outreach. One of the issues we had was that so few people that walk in the foothills had heard about this. And we thought this is something that city really needs to reach out to all people in the city and all user groups, whether you bike, walk, paint, bird watch, or just sit in a tower downtown and look at the hills. You might want to have a say in this. So the city council voted unanimously, yes, we're going to put the pause in place. We can hire a communications expert or consulting firm. And so we're very happy they've done this. There are people that are unhappy. There are people that want the trails to be built right away. So I just want to say, Save Our Foothills is very happy with this. Go ahead. So what happens now? And I just want to show you a couple of maps. The first map is, here's a shaded relief map of the foothills, Immigration Canyons down in the lower right, in the upper left, we're getting into Davis County and Tunnel Springs. In blue, I've marked existing trails that have existed for decades. There's over 100 miles of these trails already. And in purple are the 15 miles of trails that were built in 2020, 2021. Let's go to the next slide. This is the same map, but I put in red the trails that the city proposed. Yeah, somebody has said to us, it looks like a ski area. Yeah, so this is one of our issues. Do we really need all these new trails? So the city has gone back, they've rethought it. Let's look at the next slide. And what they've done is they've come up with a new plan, and the plan is being looked at by the environmental consultants. It is different. There are some big changes, but there's still 48 miles of trails in here. And so just want you to be aware that when you see these red lines going across the hillside, if they build these with the backhoe, you will see them from downtown. You will see them from everywhere in the city and possibly from the airport. Let's go to the next. And so one of our concerns, needless to say, is there's some beautiful areas in the foothills. Here's an example we're looking up in Dry Creek. I have arrows pointing where trails were planned. Fortunately, those trails are put on hold, but those, you can see in the foreground, the gouged out trail, that's what we would see switch back all across those hillsides in the back. So we are really pushing for that particular area, Dry Creek, to have a sufficient studies done. We know that it's an area where there's elk and deer spend much of the winter. We know there are wildcats in there, and we want that to be looked at carefully before we build more trails. Go ahead. So just finish up, what are the goals of our campaign? We want to work with and assist Salt Lake City, and if necessary, work against them in preparing an updated and inclusive vision for the foothills that prioritizes environmental protection and seeks input from a diverse cross-section of Salt Lake City residents. First thing we want to do is inventory existing trails. There's no inventory of the existing trails, just the decision was to make trails. We know there are 100 miles. Let's take a look at them. Prepare an updated land or a science-based land use management plan. Let's look at areas that are wilderness quality lands, identify wildlife habitat, work with the indigenous tribes to define appropriate recreation and stewardship models for the area. Then after you do a land management plan, you prepare a recreation management plan. And that includes getting user data. Instead of just saying there's tons of people, there's many more people now than before, let's get some data. And that also requires having a database baseline, not just how many people are using it, but you need to compare it. So let's collect the data now and collect it every year as we go along. Next one. After a recreation plan, that's when you start talking about a trail systems plan. And one of the things we're really pushing for is maintenance and management. You don't just build a trail and walk away. It turns out you have to take care of them. So that's one thing we're really pushing for. And then engage in really comprehensive community outreach and education regarding the foothills. Education on the natural history, the beauty of the foothills, but also recreational use. In any case, we're convinced that if the city does this properly, and if enough people pay attention and work with the city, we can preserve the foothills for a long time to come and keep them as a beautiful area. One last slide. And I do encourage you to go to our website, slcfoothills.org. This slide show will be on there, as well as a video and a lot of the other things we're doing, including we have a page looking at different aspects of the natural history of the foothills, just to get people excited about it. Thank you.
I have a question. So who thought that what they were building was a good idea to begin with? Who are these people that are pushing this, hashing and trashing, and who is it?
Well, if we look, I don't want to blame people, but I will say that the Salt Lake City's trail system plan had 4 different groups involved in it, listed on the front page. First was Salt Lake City, kind of obvious. Second was Alta Planning and Design, a planning consulting firm that had never really done work with mountain bike trails and foothills. They do a lot of work in the city here. Second was the Bonneville Shoreline Committee. And the third was Trails Utah. So Bonneville Shoreline Committee and Trails Utah are dominantly bike groups. But we know Bonneville Shoreline Trail Committee has been working on the Bonneville Shoreline Trail. Those are the groups that were initially involved. More recently, there's a group called the Salt Lake Trails Alliance that is pushing to have trails, the trails originally planned, constructed immediately and as soon as possible.
So primarily for mountain bikers. By the way, I'm a mountain biker or had been in the past, but so but it's pretty obvious as they started the work, even to an uninitiated geologist type like yourself, that they were just trashing the place, and yet they kept moving ahead. I guess I'm confused.
Well.
You see what they're doing out by the airport with the,
Is it just political that they want to say that they have this, from one end of the state to the other, a trail system connected just to say they could do it? Or is it political? Or
I can't speak, I mean, it's parks and public lands. It's now the Public Lands Department that has been responsible for overseeing the planning and the construction. They came up with a plan, they were given money, they were given permission to go ahead, and they went ahead. It turned out that there were a lot of people that were unhappy and a lot of people that didn't know about it. And that's why the city has stopped, is because when it turned out that there were a lot of unhappy people, they stopped. But ultimately, I think we can only assume that public lands and the people supporting that were involved in the preparation of this wanted lots of trails. And I do have to say, if you go to the trails plan, and they have beautiful photographs of families walking along little trails in tall grass and people building trails with hand tools. You look at the maps and their little dotted lines, and it all looks very impressive. When people started seeing the backhoes or the excavators out there and seeing what was happening, that's when people said, oh, this is not quite what we thought, but.
Okay. Because I've used it for years, bobsled is like one of my favorite, but that's been there forever, right? You're not opposed to bobsled and the pre-existing trails, are you? Or are you?
No, I've one of the things that we Save Our Foothills has been pushing is maintenance and management of existing trails, then collecting data on user, how the trails are being used, who's using them. If there's a decision that in fact we do need some more trails, then look at where you're putting them, but identify ahead of time areas like areas that. Sorry, what was that?
Use the data. In other words, how many people are really using it, and what are they using it for? I'm sure frightened. It's about being careful when you're mountain biking. When you see somebody walking, you slow down and be, and vice versa, right? Hikers look out for mountain biker. You just gotta be nice. I don't know. Okay, sorry,
No, I agree. And again, that's part of what one of our goals is simply education. And education of trail etiquette, education of trail use, education of the foothills. Maybe there are areas it's fine that you can walk off trail. Maybe some areas sometimes you shouldn't. Let's educate the trail users so that people are aware of that. And also let everybody begin to recognize the beauty of the foothills. I think almost everybody you talk to recognizes that the Central Wasatch and the Big Mountains are spectacular. Not everybody recognizes the foothills. To some of us are just as beautiful. And it's something we can really start to inform the public about, this beautiful area that we can all enjoy. And we'll be able to enjoy it for a long time if we do it carefully. And if we're going to do any construction, do it carefully and properly.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
We appreciate you coming. Thank you very much. That was most interesting.
Dan, thank you. That was great information. Next, we have Amber Anderson with Utah State Historic Preservation to talk with us about tax credits and whatever else you can enlighten us with. Thanks.
Can you see it?
Yep. Yep. Can you, Jonathan, can you see the presentation?
Yeah, ready, go.
Cool. Technology. All right, hi everyone, I'm Amber Anderson. Some of you know me already. I work for the Utah State Historic Preservation Office, or SHPO for short, if you've heard that before. And yeah, I'm going to talk to you about our 2 historic rehabilitation tax credit programs and then some good best practices for historic preservation. Right. So
Get a little closer to the mic.
yes. Can you, does that actually help? I might actually just,
Much, yeah, hold the microphone. Good idea.
how's that? Okay, all right, I need to move this now. I'm not sure what it is. Okay, so we've got 2 historic tax credit programs available here in the state of Utah. One is probably more relevant to you all than the other, but one is for residential properties. It's a Utah state income tax credit. The other is a federal income tax credit for income producing properties. And both of these are a credit, not a deduction. We'll look a little bit more closely at that on the next slide, I believe. Credit is better than a deduction. Both programs provide a credit equivalent to about 20% of your rehabilitation costs. And in order to be eligible for either of these programs, a building has to be listed on the National Register of Historic Places, either individually or as part of a historic district. It can be a contributing property in a historic district, and we'll look more at that closely as well. But then both programs also require that all the work being done to the property, inside, outside, and anywhere on the property, follow the Secretary of the Interior standards for rehabilitation. And I do have the second half of this presentation is looking more closely at those standards and kind of some of the things that do and don't work for those. Okay, so back to a tax credit. I saw lots of nods, so I assume most of you know what that is, but a tax credit is a dollar for dollar reduction of your annual tax liability. So a deduction reduces your taxable income, thereby reducing your liability, your taxes owed. A tax credit directly reduces your taxes owed. And so your annual tax liability is the annual amount that you pay in either throughout the year, at the end of the year, it's that net amount that you pay. So this is reducing that dollar for dollar. The credit is non-refundable, which doesn't mean you don't get it back as a refund. You very well may. It just means that you can only get up to your annual tax liability in any given year. And the state program allows you to carry forward any unused credit for 5 years. The federal program, you can carry it forward for 20, but it's kind of complicated. So we'll look at that more closely in a minute. But as an example, if your annual tax liability is $5,000 and you get a $4,000 credit, you only owe $1,000 that year instead of $5,000. If you have a non-refundable situation where your liability is $5,000, but you get a $6,000 credit, you get $5,000 the first year and you can roll $1,000 to the next year. So as long as your tax credit is not a lot larger than your liability, you should be able to use it all over a 6-year period. Next slide. Okay, so is my property eligible? For this particular group, I figured this historic district that I have here is probably the most relevant. There may be a little bit of another historic district that also is included with you guys, but for now, the Salt Lake City East Side Historic District is a National Register of Historic Places district. May also have some local overlay. I'm not yet, maybe. But so listed on the National Register, meaning that any property within this boundary that is considered contributing by our office would be eligible to meet the first requirement for these tax credit programs. You can go to the next slide. So in this map, there's a lot more data you can see here. So all of the green properties have been considered contributing by our office. The link for this website is available here, but use it with a grain of salt because it's not 100% accurate. You might see a property that says it's listed and it's not. You might see a property that says it's not eligible, not listed, but it is. This is a starting point, but it's always just easier to ask our office. And so some of these also might be located outside of historic districts, meaning they're not currently eligible, but they may be eligible to be listed, and you could go through that process. Just reach out mostly. Next slide. Okay, so the credit I said is equivalent to about 20% of a project's cost. That's about because not every single cost is eligible for you to calculate the credit on. Most of them are though. The majority of a project usually has qualified rehabilitation expenses associated with it. So on the left, you can see fixing walls, replacing your roof, upgrading the HVAC, plumbing, electrical, restoring your windows, things like that. Those are all eligible expenses, including soft costs like permit fees, architect fees, things like that. You can use those to calculate your credit. On the right-hand side, you can't use those to calculate your credit. You can't get a credit for buying a historic property, unfortunately. Can't get it for building an addition, site work, landscaping, things like that. Makes sense? Oh, I guess, sorry, at the bottom there, I did note that if you're pursuing the state program, the qualified expenses are slightly different than the federal program. So just, we'd want to look at like the actual law itself if this was going to be an issue. So just keep that in mind. Okay, so the state credit, which again is probably most relevant here, for residential buildings, it doesn't historically have to be residential, but it has to be residential after your project is complete. So it could be a historic house, it could be a commercial building that you turn into a residence, things like that. You only have to be spending $10,000 in up to a 3-year period, which I'm sure anyone who owns a house knows is relatively easy to do, unfortunately. Probably can't even get a roof for that these days, but so you have up to 3 years to spend $10,000, but there's currently no limit to the amount of subsequent overall projects you do. So if you do a $16,000 project over 2 years, you can close it out, start claiming your credit, do a $10,000 project the next year, close it out, start claiming your credit. And then, anything between up to 3 years, as long as you're at least 10,000. I mentioned that all of the work has to follow the Secretary of the Interior standards for rehabilitation. That's true for an additional 3 years after you get the credit. So you can't do this project that meets the standards and then get your credit and then, tear the building down the next day. You'd have to pay the credit back. That's not allowed. And then I already mentioned that you can carry forward the state credit for 5 years. And then, okay, federal program is for income producing buildings. Income producing can be commercial, it can be office, restaurant, things like that, event space. It can also be residential rental. So if you have a residential rental situation and you meet all the requirements for both state and federal, we're looking at a 40% combined credit. So that can be rather substantial. However, the federal program's requirements are lofty. You have to be meeting a substantial rehab test at the federal level, which is much more than $10,000 typically. It's based on your specific property's value, and we'd want to look specifically at that formula if this is something you were interested in. And then at the federal level, you have to maintain ownership of the property for 5 years after receiving the credit, as well as compliance with those preservation standards for 5 years. At the state level, you don't have to maintain ownership, but you do have to maintain compliance with the standards, which doesn't really make sense because it would be hard. It'd be hard to do if you didn't own it. So it's kind of weird loophole, but and then so the federal credit, you used to be able to claim it all in the first year after your project if your tax liability was large enough to absorb it. In 2017, the tax reform changed it, so you have to spread it out over a minimum of 5 years, but you can continue carrying it forward for an additional 16 for a total of 21. I think you can actually go backwards a year too, so 22. It got it a little bit more complicated and devalued the credit a little bit just with inflation and interest rates and things like that. But so yeah, you have to claim it over a minimum of 5, but can go roll it forward for a lot more than the state level. I won't read through all these, just kind of a summary of the differences between the state and the federal program. The biggest one I want to point out is at the very bottom. The state program is administered by our office pretty much entirely. We handle the review, the approval, the appeals process. The federal credit, however, the National Park Service has final approval, but you work with our office as a liaison to kind of help you through the application process, make sure the work, is in the right track, things like that. And then we communicate with the Park Service to kind of give them our opinion and vice versa. All right. How to start? Honestly, the thing that I would wish everybody would do before they download an application is just reach out first. If you talk to us first, we can make sure the building is eligible, that the use is correct, that you're going to be spending enough, that you are applying for the right program, and most importantly, that the work you're doing is at all aligned with the program. Because if you come to us after doing a bunch of work and it doesn't meet the standards, you are very well potentially disqualified. If you come to us before you start the work, we can help guide it in a way that's going to most likely meet the standards as long as you're open to it. But yeah, contact us early, often, all the time. Don't worry about bothering us. And then for some reason you decide not to do that, I would say the next piece of advice I would give is to thoroughly document a building or a space before you touch it. Because if we don't know what you started with, it's really hard to know if the work that you did met the standards. So ideally, you start the application before you start the work. That almost never happens. But still make sure you have lots of documentation. Legally, you do have to get approval before you finish your entire overall project, or you disqualified yourself. So legally, you have to apply before it's done. You don't have to apply before it's started, but it's highly recommended that you apply before it started. Otherwise, you could disqualify yourself. Okay. This is what our application at the state level looks like. I actually just changed it recently. It'll look very similar. The logo will be a little bit different, but it'll look essentially the same. So at the state level, you have basically a before and an after. So the before application is where you propose the work that you want to do and you provide documentation on what you're starting with. That helps us evaluate if the work that you're planning meets the preservation standards. Ideally, it does. We review it, we issue a project pre-approval, you carry out the project, and then you submit the after application, the part 3, documenting that you did what you said you were going to do, hopefully. Which is not always the case. But so it's pretty straightforward at the state level. Next slide. The federal program is a little bit different. Sometimes there's a part 1, sometimes there's only a part 2 and a part 3. Essentially, the part 2 is like the before application at the state level. It's where you document, you provide a detailed work plan for proposal, and then part 3 is the after application. Part 1 is when if you have to determine whether or not a building is significant, which if you're not pursuing federal, I won't bother to get into that, but if anyone has questions, I'm happy to answer them. Go ahead and switch to the next one. You can let that in our outfit. But before we jump into the standards and some more best practices, does anyone have any questions on the basics of the program, the application process?
Does it include landscaping?
No, landscaping is not. Landscaping has to meet the standards, but it's not an eligible expense. So no-ish. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I'm having a little trouble hearing, but did you, how often can you repeat it? So in other words, let's say you do a project that's $30,000 and then 20 years later, you want to do another one. Is there a waiting period?
Currently, there's no limit to the number of subsequent applications you do. So anything you're doing at a given time goes on one application. It's not like project-based necessarily, it's overall project. But then as soon as you close that, you can open a new one the next day, or 5 years from now, 10 years from now. There's currently no limitations to that.
I have one question with you, Amber. We've had 5 projects with you.
What's your name?
The Career West on Douglas Street.
Oh, okay.
And yes, we have done things where we haven't gotten permission to begin with, and Amber has saved our bacon. But, and we're grateful. What about the certificate of appropriateness from the city?
So the certificate of appropriateness
Which
is
is harder to get today than it was 20 years ago.
if you're also in a Salt Lake City local district, which you are, but maybe not everybody is, the certificate of appropriateness at the city level that you have to legally work with them to get for local districts has no bearing on our review. In theory, we should agree.
Can I have done this project without going through that? I went with
They don't take our review into consideration, and we don't take their review into consideration. So if you are in a local district, you still have to work with the city, but if you want tax credits, you still have to work with us. Do it at the same time, or do one right after the other, because mine doesn't guarantee theirs and theirs doesn't guarantee mine.
Thank you.
Yep. But it's been good to work with you as well. Okay. Any other questions before we jump to the next one? Hey. Actually, go back to the last one, sorry. All right, so the 2 tax credit programs require that any work being done meet the Secretary of the Interior standards for rehabilitation. I just wanted to point out that the National Park Service has 4 sets of standards. Standards for preservation means standards for preserving something exactly how it is. Standards for restoration means restoring it back to a certain period of time based on evidence. Reconstruction, pretty obvious, reconstructing something based on evidence. But rehabilitation acknowledges the need to add and alter certain things while still prioritizing and maintaining the historic character of our property. So we evaluate, when we review these, we evaluate what the historic character defining features of a property are, and we prioritize maintaining those while allowing for more change in other areas and to other materials. Next slide. This is all of them. Next slide. We look at them individually. So standard number 1 is that a property shall be used for its historic purpose or placed in a new use that requires minimal change to the defining characteristics of the building and its site and environment. So just a caveat, I apologize, most of these examples are commercial, which I realize most of you probably have residential projects. The principles still apply. So just, you know, I'm working on getting more examples that are residential, but the same idea applies. Just keep that in mind. But for this one, the example is on the left, we have a historic warehouse where they turned it into a co-working space. So the way that they did this meets the standards because they were able to maintain a lot of those historic character defining features such as a large open volume of space, like a historic warehouse, those unfinished exposed materials like the brick, the concrete, the structure, things like that. It looks like maybe they kept the original windows up in the upper left-hand corner. They added a mezzanine, it looks like, in the upper right-hand corner to increase floor space without breaking up the building in a way that wasn't in keeping with its historic character. On the right-hand side, we see an example that doesn't meet the standards. It's cool, I live there, but they essentially took a historic church and they chopped it up into a bunch of apartments. So you don't experience that large volume of worship space that you would have originally. They took the finishes off, which today is really popular, but historically a church would have always had finishes. That would have been highly embarrassing, if not disrespectful to the deity in question. And so the example on the right is not a great use. You may be able to turn a church into a residence, but probably not in a super profitable way, I would imagine, and still meet standard number 1. Next slide. Standard number 2, the historic character of a property shall be retained and preserved. The removal of historic materials or alteration of features and spaces that characterize a property shall be avoided. So this one's probably a little bit easier to envision how it might relate to a residential building. But this is a historic office building in downtown Salt Lake. On the left-hand side, you can see the original historic arrangement of the property. The rooms were smaller, the ceiling was a normal ceiling height, the walls were finished, there's woodwork, there's casings, there's wainscoting, things like that, probably carpet or hardwood. And then on the right-hand side, you can see what they did. They removed the finishes, which again would have been highly embarrassing. Never would have an office have ever been exposed masonry or exposed concrete. They removed the human scale ceiling. They added this industrial exposed structure and ductwork in there. It's not an industrial property. It's a residential property or office property. They got rid of the main corridor. So we look at floor plan as a character defining feature sometime. And that corridor that's very typical of an office with the transportation and then the office is off of it is gone. So they removed a lot of the original character defining features. This example does not meet the standards. Standard number 3, each property shall be recognized as a physical record of its time, place, and use. Changes that create a false sense of historical development, such as adding conjectural features or architectural elements from other buildings, shall not be undertaken. This one's a little bit harder to swallow, I think, because we don't want to discourage using salvaged materials, right? Like that's a good thing. But you have to look at where the material came from, what it looks like, because so in this example, we have a 1930s bank building. The before is on the left-hand side. So 1930s rural Utah, Art Deco-ish features. And then on the right-hand side, they got these beautiful wooden doors from a schoolhouse in New Jersey from the early 1900s. So nothing about that door is in keeping with this original bank building. And so, I mean, we'd rather them, use that than a new Home Depot door, I guess, but it doesn't meet the standard in that it creates a false sense of historical development. Next slide. Standard number 4, most properties change over time. Those changes that have acquired historic significance in their own right shall be retained and preserved. So this is an example of the Union Block building in Brigham City. And for historic buildings listed on the National Register, we have what's called a period of significance. In this case, it was 1892 to 1929. Historic districts usually have a much larger period of significance. So the one that's most relevant to you it probably goes through the 50s or 60s, I would imagine. But so when changes happen within that period of significance, we evaluate whether or not they've acquired their own significance. Sometimes they haven't, sometimes they have. So in this example, 1900 facade had two very distinct, highly glazed, lots of divisions, two very distinct openings. By pretty early in the period of significance, they had the central facade that was very different. You know, it was one open glass feature, prism glass with these little awning or hopper windows. Structurally, it was completely different. And then when they started this project in 2016, they wanted to take it back to the 1900s facade, but we knew that there was this pretty early 1912 or earlier facade. So we had conversations, it was a commercial project. So we had conversations with the National Park Service, and with the history and the documentation, we determined that the middle facade was actually the most significant. It had acquired its own significance, had been around for longer during the period of significance. And so if they wanted to restore it, they would have to take it back to 1912, not 1900. So you could probably see how that might apply to a residential building where if a change happened really early on, so maybe the house was built in 1922, but you know the windows were replaced in 1930 and the period of significance ends in 1960. We might think the 1930 windows are actually more appropriate because they were there for a longer period of time. They experienced more history. Kind of just depends on the situation. Slide. Number 5. Distinctive features, finishes, and construction techniques or examples of craftsmanship that characterize a historic property shall be preserved. So the two photos on the left-hand side is the A&Z warehouse building in downtown Salt Lake City. On the left-hand or before photo, you can see that it had this kind of Art Deco, Art Moderne style with that vertically oriented entrance, the tile work that went up above the roof line, and then the stucco with the horizontal scoring. It's all very 1930s architecturally. But the owners wanted to make it more historic by returning it to something that it never was. So they wanted to expose the brick, which you can tell by looking at that brick. It was never meant to be seen. It's patchy, it's all over the place. They kind of cut off that entrance. They got the scoring's not there anymore. They ended up replacing the windows as well. So they weren't keeping the craftsmanship and the character that defined the historic building. They created a false sense again of history. And on the right hand side, we have a floor plan of I believe it's just kind of a 4 square in Hillcrest. And so the floor plan is actually pretty character defining here with that middle central staircase, that central corridor, the parlor and the dining room on either side. So if they wanted to come in and completely change that or just rip out all of the walls, that wouldn't meet the standards. It wouldn't be preserving the character. Maybe they widen the doorways a little bit, but they still maintain the general opening, the general sense of a wall, but completely changing that would not meet the standards, especially given how close it is to the front of the building. Next slide. Standard number 6, deteriorated historic features shall be repaired rather than replaced where the severity of deterioration requires replacement of a distinctive feature. The new feature shall match the old in design, color, texture, and other visual qualities, and where possible, materials. Replacement of missing features shall be substantiated by documentary, physical, or pictorial evidence. So windows are a big one here. This applies to other areas as well, but windows are really difficult. Windows they're difficult. They have a bad rap. They can go on for a long time. So I will not stay on the soapbox long, but windows get a bad rap. They're not as weather tight as new windows, sure, but a lot of historic windows just haven't been maintained. There's a lot you can do to make them tighter, to make them more thermally efficient. You can install storm windows. You can replace the sash cords. You can cut the paint. You know, people have told me I have to replace my windows because they're painted shut. It's like, would you like a box cutter? Like, I know that doesn't seem like great justification to me. But anyways, windows get a bad rap. They're extremely character defining. There's so much craftsmanship in them. They were designed to be repaired. You can literally take the pieces apart. And then the glass obviously always has more texture and things like that. But anyways, off my soapbox now. But when they do need to be replaced, and sometimes they do, sometimes they're too far gone, sometimes it would be way too expensive to fix them. And we know that, we understand that. The replacements need to be a really good match. So if you were to replace this 2/2 double hung window with a vinyl window that had a dividing bar in between 2 panes of glass, we would not approve that. We almost never approve vinyl anyways, unless it's a really simple window and you can replace it with a really simple vinyl window. For the most part, it needs to be wood or aluminum clad, some material that they can actually create these proportions. So like we look at the width of the rails and the styles. We look at the width of the muntins, we look at the molding profiles, we look at all of these little details, the finishes. And all of those things need to be a really good match if we're going to approve something like that in order to maintain the character, the shadow lines, the depth, just all of the different features. Next slide. Okay, standard number 7, I could talk about for hours, but chemical or physical treatments such as sandblasting that cause damage to historic materials shall not be used. The surface cleaning of structures, if appropriate, shall be undertaken using the gentlest means possible. So these are 2 examples of what not to do. So on the left-hand side, you see a building that was sandblasted. Sand, and it would not have looked like this immediately. It would have looked completely fine right after you sandblasted it to remove paint or grime, dirt, things like that. But brick, at least historically, was made in such a way that the bricks were fired so that the exterior coating was harder and it was protective. It was a protective outer coating and the interior was softer, weaker, required protection. So when you use an abrasive blasting of any kind, it just chips small little pieces out and you might not see them at first. But as the weather goes, as water gets in, expands, contracts, freezes, all those good things, biogrowth gets in, it slowly grows. The chips get bigger and then eventually you can see it. And then after that, it starts to get sandy and it starts to just slough off and fall apart. It takes decades to get to that point, but we don't want to do that. We want to promote the longevity of the building and the materials. So sandblasting is a big no. On the right-hand side, you see what happens when you use a mortar that is inappropriate for your brick. A lot of contractors will tell you, or even design professionals will tell you that a Portland cement-based mortar is great. It's hard, it's strong. Why wouldn't you want that? But again, brick historically was meant to expand and contract. It was meant to breathe. So historically, the mortar was a sacrificial element. You had the masonry construction, and as the bricks expanded and contracted with moisture and temperature variations, the mortar could just slough off, and eventually you'd replace it, and it was fine. But when you put a hard mortar in there, like Portland cement, or a hard stucco, or something like that, it makes the brick the sacrificial element. So it still tries to expand and contract, but when it has nowhere to go because there's nothing around it that's giving, it just breaks down. It starts to crack. It'll eventually will do what you see here. And it's a similar reason why we don't want to paint brick, why we don't want to put water sealants on it, because it needs to breathe, it needs to expand and contract. I see your face. Some are better than others. Some are better than others. It depends on where you put it.
Seeping through into the plaster.
Is the alley paved?
Yeah.
That's fine. Because you don't want to, concrete, you don't want to put concrete up against brick either, which so many contractors will tell you is the best idea in the world.
So when did they start using harder mortar?
Like pretty early, like 30s, I want to say.
Okay.
So yeah, it depends on the era of brick, but
You might be safe.
yeah, it depends. It depends. But concrete up again, I see this all the time. It's been done a lot and it's still being recommended a lot. Concrete up against a brick wall is going to create a couple of problems. It's going to create splashback, which is creating more water on your masonry building, which they're meant to breathe and dry out, but you don't want to just have a constant source. But then it's also trapping it. So the moisture is in the wall and now it has nowhere to go. It can't get out. So it's just deteriorating. And this is actually near the ground. So you can see obviously near the ground it's going to get more, but what you would want to do instead is to chisel out the concrete away from the wall and then create a French drain system so that the water can drain appropriately into the ground and go away from the building.
I thought I was done with the project.
If it's still a problem, if it hasn't seemed to help, then you might want to consider it. If I would say monitor it for now.
Well, we used to have garbage collected in the alley in Douglas Street, and so the previous owner just put a big cement slab against the house, the little carriage house.
Yep.
Because that's where the garbage cans.
Yep.
And I guess I have no problem taking it out. We don't do garbage on the alley anymore.
Yeah. So yeah, it could be helpful if you
Yeah.
do take it out. Make sure it's taken out really carefully because you don't want to damage the brick in the process. That could cause more harm than good. So
Yeah.
but yeah, I recently had a project where a contractor was recommending somebody put a concrete pad up against a sandstone foundation, and sandstone is like the softest stone. Please don't do that. Please don't.
But in our house on Douglas Street, it is a red rock sandstone foundation, but they put cement over it in 1932.
Yeah, so-
Because poor people had rock foundations and
Right.
wealthier people had cement foundations.
And the cement from 1932 was probably a lot less detrimental than the cement from today. It's probably a different, a mix that's less cement and more, it has like sand probably mixed in with it.
So I have to consult when I decide to do work on my foundation.
Yeah, we actually,
Not for
so
sure.
I don't know if you ever worked with our historical architects.
Very much.
We have, I don't know if you've met our current one, but we have a historical architect on staff who can provide a lot of really good advice on this more technical stuff, as well as things like building code, because I have a slide on this later, but a lot of the times contractors, design professionals, the city will tell you, oh, you have to do this because of code. When so many times there is a different alternative that will still meet code, that won't damage the building, that won't prevent you from getting tax credits. So I'll harp on that in a minute, but next step. And number 8 is about archaeological resources. I don't deal with this. If it comes up, I direct you to the archaeologists on our staff. But essentially, if archaeological resources are being affected, there needs to be a plan for that, either to be kept or the removal to be mitigated. This is just an example. The Rio Grande Depot that our offices used to be in was obviously a depot. So there's historical archaeology on the west side, of course, because of all the rail lines. And so if someone were building a building right behind, we would need to look at mitigating the effects on those archaeological resources. Okay, and then the last 2 standards are about additions, alterations, new construction. And the main principles are that these things shouldn't destroy the historic materials. They should be differentiated as old, not fake historic, and compatible. Also removable if necessary. So I'll touch on the last one first. For this addition, this archives of building addition that was added to the Rio Grande Depot in the early 2000s, I think. In the right-hand picture, you see it's attached, which is kind of a little glass hyphen. So if they remove that in the future, the Rio Grande Depot would be fine. It's very easily changed, easily reversed. But then the building itself also it's obviously not historic, but it's compatible. It's using the same language as the depot. So it's not taller than, it doesn't sit more forward than, it's brick and stone like the depot is. It has the same kind of language with the banding and the paired windows. So it's compatible, but not fake old, easily removable, and doesn't destroy the historic materials of the Rio Grande Depot. So this is a great way of meeting standards number 9 and 10.
Is that kind of like what they did with Trolley Square?
Probably. I haven't.
Those surrounding buildings.
Yeah, probably. They're obviously not original, but they have the similar kinds of materials. The scale may be a little questionable, just how much they added, but yeah, definitely the same principles. Next slide. This is kind of what we're already talking about. I just threw some tips in here. Just don't assume just because your contractor says you should that you should. I've had tax credit projects get into real hot water, even projects that the people have done them for years because they assume that their contractor knows what's best. I don't want you to be afraid of your contractor. I don't want to discourage you from trusting your contractor, but they don't always know what's best. So it's really important to make sure you propose all of the work to us so that we can review it. We can help find other solutions. I always encourage you in life in general, but to ask a lot of questions. Like, does this actually have to happen? Do we actually need to replace this? Can we fix it? Because a lot of the times it's just easier to replace it, and that's why it's being suggested. It doesn't mean it has to be replaced. It doesn't mean it's more expensive to fix it. It's easier. So ask questions, be suspicious. Don't always assume that somebody tells you the correct thing. And then get second opinions. I've had so many times when someone tells me they have to replace their original hardwood floors because their contractor told them it's too thin to refinish. And then they go talk to somebody else and they're like, oh no, it's fine. So ask questions, get second opinions, be suspicious, I guess is my piece of advice here. Next slide. And then lastly, here's some links. The last 2 are just the home pages for the 2 tax credit programs. If you go to the state one, it has information on both. The first one is kind of the homepage for all the things about the Secretary of the Interior standards that have to be followed. But then the preservation by topic link is my absolute favorite. It's actually a new link. If you've ever used it before, they completely changed their website, which is highly inconvenient. But It's great. Everything that you could ever want to know about how to treat a historic property is in alphabetical order. So if you have any questions about windows, you go to W, takes you down to windows, and there's like 25 PDFs on how to repair your windows, how to choose a good replacement windows, how to find good storm windows. It just tons and tons and tons of good information, preservation by topic. I think the last one might just be, my actual contact info this time. So yeah, thank you for listening. I hope this is helpful. I've already worked with some of you. I hope to work with more of you. Let me know if you have any questions.
Thank you, Amber. And just so everyone knows, we are going to be sending out an email to everybody who's on our list with all those emails that you have, as well as Dan's information for that website. So watch for that.
Can she share the slide deck? Can you send us the slide?
I have the set, I have the deck. We can, yeah, I
Super
can,
cool.
Okay.
awesome.
Always learning.
And now Nathan Siegel, I'm going to ask him to come up and talk with us. So he's going to give us a different perspective. Just he has used the tax credits and just talk a little bit about what kind of projects they've done.
Thank you. I'm gonna make this relatively quick. Amber, you were super thorough. Thank you for covering everything there. Almost everything I thought about discussing was covered well. My name is Nate Siegel. We've been in the university area since 2015, along with my wife Hannah and our two kids who are running around here. At that point, we purchased a historic property on Douglas Street in Fort South and took on renovating the property. We are well positioned to take that on, as my wife is an interior designer and historic architecture buff. So the tax credit piece was what I was tasked with. My background, my professional life, I'm a CFP financial advisor, so this is kind of up my alley. We had worked actually with Amber's predecessor, so have not worked with her directly yet. We're hoping to do another project here soon. But just wanted to share my experience with the program, and maybe share a little bit about the way that the incentive is calculated, just to put it into terms that you can easily digest whether this makes sense for you to pursue. So the tax credit is a direct offset of your income tax liability. Your income tax liability in Utah is super simple. It's 5% of your earned income. So if you earn $100,000 per year, you have a $5,000 state income tax liability. So the way that this project, or this program, excuse me, can help you with that is that a 20% tax credit on the total cost of your project is going to directly offset that liability. So $100,000 a year salary, $5,000 a year tax liability. If you do a $100,000 renovation project on your eligible home, that's $20,000 tax credit that you can use on your taxes. So if you continue to make that $100,000 a year, that 100% offsets your state tax liability for 4 years in a row. So you would either have that money returned to you if you work a W-2 job, or just not have to pay it if you're self-employed. So just wanted to kind of put that in perspective and hopefully explain that in a way that makes sense for folks. It's a very attractive program. If you're doing anything of size on your home, I think it's worth getting with the office and making sure that your project conforms. But yeah, I'm gonna leave it with that, talking about some tax items, and thank you all.
Anybody else have anything to add?
I'm almost afraid to say anything, Amber, because I probably have screwed stuff up.
That's how I felt.
Can I,
Okay.
I will say, we replaced the windows in our house.
Do you want the mic? Because the people won't hear it that are.
Fine,
So
virtual.
hard
I know.
Thanks, Cindy.
We've done 5 tax credits with Amber and her predecessor. Who's the state architect now?
Jansen Bennett,
I don't know him.
he just started in
Who was his predecessor?
Steve Cornell.
Yes, and they're before them?
Dawn. Hartley.
Yeah, because we've been in the house for 27 years. In defense of the windows, we first started with the city. And when we started working on this house, it was something called the Landmarks Commission. When we bought the house from Boyd Wagstaff, he referred to you as the hysterical society. And he never did tax credit, and you could show. Because he wired the house and he just did some crazy stuff to it. We also have a contributing dwelling on our alley that is a 2-story apartment. And we have solar panels on that. So we hadn't done anything for 15 years, and we went back to what is now the Planning Commission and asked to put the solar panels on our alley. If you walk in the alley, it's 208 South. They're not, you can't see them from the street. And if there is ever an earthquake, come to our garage because you will be safe. Because the city made us overplan like you wouldn't believe with that structure. So when I went for the windows, the previous owner, our house looks like an English Tudor house now, and it was originally that, but in the 30s, when they covered up the red rock foundation, they also put another layer of stucco that almost looked like Z-brick. If you ever come, I'll show you pictures, but it looked like it was a brick house. And so when we were working on this house, the first time around, we were told we had to replace it back to the original facade so we get that plaque on the front door. And Dawn is the one who said, don't take off what you've got there, just put a 3rd layer of stucco on the house. It's very soundproof. We still have heat bills though. And the previous owner had clad all the windows in aluminum for like 40 or 50 years. And I demonstrated that I could take a big pen and put a pen through the wood. I mean, it was just really kind of trashed. And so, although I have a lot of things in my house that are preserved and I'm proud of, when I did my COVID DIY and we did the living room and dining room, we did put new windows in. We bought weather shield windows. We spent $15,000 on 7 windows. And we learned things like what is it?
The medium rail style, the Munson.
They're different dimensions.
Yeah.
Now everything's exactly the same dimension, but on the weather shield windows, the bottom rail is bigger than the top rail. And I have pictures I put in a 32-page proposal to the city because I was figuring after the crap they'd given us with the solar panels, they were going to say absolutely not. And within 24 hours, they gave us a certificate of appropriateness. Yes, I had pictures. I demonstrated the big pen trick. And Weather Shield makes historic windows and they're custom made and they met the old windows. I also gave those old windows to a young lady in Rose Park. Can we have a moment of silent prayer for her? She wanted to use them and I gave her everything. I gave her the lead weights. I gave her the crown, everything, the moldings, everything. And they're probably still sitting in her garage 3 years later. So that's okay. She's younger than me. So we did do that. And then when it came inside to redoing the molding in our house, a lot of it was done by previous owners with very poor wood. I took my molding to a shop and I said, recreate this for me. And what I have in there is exact dimension of what was there, but it is new. Is it okay?
Yeah.
That's all I'm saying. That's all I'm gonna say. But, and my husband he was a CFO and he's taking care of all the tax credit stuff. And I promised him when we bought this house, we wouldn't spend more than $100,000. He's still married to me, but it was a little bit more than that.
Thank you, Cindy. And with that, I think we'll adjourn unless anybody has anything to, why don't you come up and talk about that too with us real quickly.
I'm Kathy Scott, and I also live in a historic home. And yes, I took advantage of tax credits about 20 years ago. Quite a few of them. Carried it on for 5 years. But I'm here tonight because I attend Our Lady of Lourdes Church, which is on the corner of 700 South and 1100 East. It's on the same block where Judge Memorial High School is located. And you might have read in the paper that at this time, the Diocese of Salt Lake City is exploring the possibility of selling the 7.7 acres, which includes Judge Memorial, also Our Lady of Lourdes Elementary School, the church, and the rectory where the priests live. And those of us that attend the church actually predates Judge Memorial High School. by about 12 years. And we'd like to keep the church. We don't see why it would be necessary to sell the church. It sits on 4/10 of an acre of the 7.7 acres, which is only 5%. And it doesn't make a lot of sense to sell it. But the diocese, I think, feels that it would be tidier to sell the whole thing. So there is a movement among those who attend the church and those who live in the neighborhood right close to the church, and like the scale of the church and the materials that the church is made of and the fact that it is historic, and to make a movement to preserve it. So I have some little postcards here tonight, and they're pre-addressed, and there's a little spot where you can write your little message. And if you'd like to fill them out, several of you have already. And just write a sentence or two. Say who you are, that you're in the neighborhood, that you appreciate old buildings, or there's something particular about the church you like, and why you would like to see it stay. And I have stamps and I'll mail them tomorrow. So I'll have them on that back table there. Thanks.
All right. Hi.
Through?
Yeah.
Thank you for coming.
Yes.
We appreciate it.
So this is what I